Hi, I'm Kyle Mathews. I founded Gatsby, the Gatsby JS React website framework. So yeah, it's very much on the website of things. Yeah.
I'm Evan Bacon. I work at Expo. I work on a project called Expo for Web, which takes React Native for web and makes it kind of more accessible to people and rounds it out. I also work on making that work with Gatsby. But before that, I spent years as a native developer. So I guess I'm just conflicted.
Hi, I'm Necoline Hubner. I work at a place called Development Seed. Prior to that, I worked heavily with web apps. And so I'm more on the web app side and work on client projects with people like NASA and World Bank currently.
Hi everyone, I'm Florian. I'm working as a software engineer at Google in a team called Android Games. So you will say I'm more on the native side. Well, actually, depends. I'm really interested in all that the web can do. And I've been doing this game editor that is part C++, part JavaScript, and that is running well in a web browser.
Cool. So maybe we can start off by kind of defining terms a little bit. So I'm curious about, say, for example, progressive web apps. So Kyle, does Gatsby, I think, espouses itself as a progressive web app framework of sorts. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it. Yeah.
All right. So, but it's also a static site generator. So we put in some code, we get static HTML on the other side. Very similar to, say, on old GeoCities or Angel Fire website.
Kind of, yeah.
All right. So would those also qualify as progressive web apps, or how would you define a progressive web app?
Yeah, the idea, kind of the term progressive web app is it kind of progresses, where a straight web app, it just is purely client side, where progressive, it sort of starts as a, kind of static HTML version of the app, and then it kind of hydrates into a full-blown app. So Gatsby, you create a React app, but then for each page in your site at build time, we pre-render that to an HTML page. And so when a user loads a Gatsby site, they first get the HTML. So the site, pixels appear on the screen as quickly as possible. But then the JavaScript comes in to hydrate that into your normal React components, your React app. So it kind of is the whole idea of progressive web app is the best of both worlds, of both the website world and the web app world. That you get, kind of fast, lightweight loading, but then all the sort of app-like stuff you want to do, like service workers and kind of rich client-side interactions are straightforward as well.
So, I think SEO is also kind of a concern there,
yeah,
right?
SEO too, yeah.
Where web apps kind of live and die by their ability for Google to find them and index them and send them customers.
Yeah.
I'd be curious kind of on the Expo side, right? Whenever you're compiling out, Expo is exclusively for apps, presumably. That is the primary target there. How do you see Expo kind of existing inside of the PWA world?
So now with Expo for Web, you can build a website, but you also take that same existing native code and you turn that into a website. So there's a lot of features which make a lot more sense in a PWA than they do in a web app, and they kind of get watered down and create this very optimal PWA. So an example I really like is the safe area view, where if you take a lot of websites and you render them as PWAs, usually if the phone has a notch, you see that the UI gets cut off and they're maybe the splash screen doesn't load or the offline doesn't make sense just right out of the box. You don't really get any of those problems with Expo Web because you have to create a splash screen for a native app and you have to account for the safe area view in a native app, and so these things just carry over. But it's also all an application very similar to Create React App, and it's less of a pre-rendered system.
Yeah, so an entire app, it starts very much on the app side without maybe the progressive part?
Yeah, you don't necessarily need the progressive parts because it is just fully native. It has access to all of the native device features, and then it kind of removes whichever parts aren't available. For instance, there is some weirdness where if you have a native app on iOS and it has access to the camera and you load that in the Safari browser, you still have access to the camera, but if you turn that into a PWA, now it loses access to the camera for whatever reason. So it really just each feature works differently based off wherever it's being run.
Interesting. And then I think kind of curious on your side. So you are maybe more native than a lot of the rest of us, right? So you're working on a system that works deeply with native systems.
Yeah, well, I started by mostly working on native stuff, but on desktop. Before seeing the web as a huge opportunity for reaching out to more people. And yeah, I think that when we are speaking about progressive web apps, what I like is the term progressive, and it's the fact that it's a spectrum of progressive web apps. You can have a news content website that is only interested in having something that is really fast to load, and you can also go more on the apps side and have something that is maybe a bit longer to load, but still working very well and taking advantage of everything that you have on your phone. So that's what I like in the progressive web apps approach. And in a way, I mean, there are people trying to improve things for apps. Like we have the Google Instant apps on Android that are trying to minimize the size of the app so that they can load really quickly. But I think that the progressive web apps are a great way to make things more to load seamlessly, yeah, and to still provide something that looks like an app.
Out of curiosity, I mean, is there a way that you approach a project and you decide whether you want to go native or progressive web app? Are there certain feature sets that you say, well, this is going to have to hit these performance marks, and so it should be native, or it has to be accessible to these people, so it should be web? I'm curious how each of you kind of approaches the distinction here. Can I start, Necoline?
I can.
Yeah.
So in my experience, it's a variation of the resources, the timeline, and the users that are going to be accessing it. Depending on what you have available to you, it might make a lot of sense to make a progressive web app rather than a web app and a native app due to the amount of resources required to do both of them. And if you're trying to get your app on the phones of users in remote environments, for example, that the data usage that a progressive web app requires versus a native app, if the functionality is not too heavy, can make a lot of sense.
So is there anything to do with maybe, I mean, different markets, difference, maybe internet speeds and that kind of thing? So would you choose, say, for example, a native app in a market, say, like India versus a progressive web app, or would it be vice versa?
So I've found that progressive web apps are very good for like low internet speeds, and the data usage is a big part of it because progressive web apps are lighter than native apps, or they can be, and I think a lot of companies are choosing to create both depending on the needs of the user. And so also if you're working on emerging markets and trying to identify the needs of the user, it's much easier to iterate with a progressive web app, where with native you have to constantly get those refreshes.
So iteration cycle might be another very important consideration then.
Yeah, exactly. Like how fast you're moving and why you're making those changes for which user groups.
I see. I'm curious, does that match up?
Well, with Expo Web, kind of the target idea is that you don't have to decide or choose anymore. Like if you need to build an app or a website, you just make one and then it runs on every...
It's a false dichotomy. We don't have to even make this choice, yeah.
Right, right. So just you make it as optimally as you can, and then it's up to the platform that you're running it on to like work as well as it can. And if you have something where there's a complex gesture or interaction and maybe it doesn't work as well on the web, it doesn't mean as much as it used to because you can always just run it natively, and now it works exactly as you expected it to. The same with like data usage and offline support and things of that nature.
So one of the challenges I think with maybe progressive web apps in general, right? So this is certainly an area where I think most of the audience, and me included, feel much more comfortable, right, than maybe on the native side. But they often do seem like they are much more limited in terms of the feature set that they have access to, right? So native iOS apps can do some really cool things that are maybe not exposed inside of, say, mobile Safari. How do you see those restrictions kind of playing into progressive web apps, and like, do you see hope in the future for more of this functionality being exposed to mobile apps or mobile web apps?
I would just say that's sometimes true for sure, but I think it's like complex functionality that nobody uses is not as interesting. Anyway, so the big advantage the web has is just distribution. It's like it's a lot more people. It's way easier to just like get somebody to open up a link versus installing a new app on their phone. So, you know, and most functionality that most apps need is great on the web. And where I see kind of the distinction is that native apps win for kind of more complex apps that have like deeper ongoing engagement with users, because then if they're going to be using it a bunch, then it's like not as hard to convince them to install it and so forth. And like the kind of the improved experience, you know, pays off over time. Where if somebody's probably going to, you know, use something 2-3 times and then go about their lives, then the ease of them, you know, starting to use it matters a lot more than whether if it's technically, you know, 20% smoother or something in a native app. So.
Does that end up reflecting on maybe the types of businesses that can succeed in the web versus in the native space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the apps that are popular are like photo apps and communication apps and social networking apps and that sort of stuff. And those sorts of things are, you know, used daily, hourly, type thing by lots of people. But, you know, e-commerce apps, for example, are extremely uncommon to get much traction. Almost everyone just goes to the website. Like Amazon keeps bugging me to install their app, and I'm still like, whatever,
Yeah.
you know, type thing.
Well, it'd make Bezos very happy if you did, though. I think he'd be very happy.
He's probably happy regardless. So he's fine. It's probably the PM that's mad.
So, Bryan, I mean, you are working on the extreme native side here, right?
For sure.
You've gone all the way back to the basics, and you're like, windowing systems, they're no good. I'm going to start from OpenGL up. How do you kind of think about whenever you're building this system framework that's a bit like Expo in its ability to target both native and web? How do you kind of think about least common denominator problems and providing a good experience on both sides?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sorry I was late to the party here. But I actually have experience building Cordova apps and Electron apps at Microsoft. I worked on a team that shipped Power Apps and another team that shipped an app called GigJam. And I think like the most important thing is to use the right tool for the job. Like you need to ship something that works for your customers and something that they can use and that makes them happy. So I might not go to the lengths that I went for OniVim for like other classes of apps because it just like what you get for that maybe doesn't make sense for that user base. So I think you have to pick the right tool for the job.
And then in designing, I think, Reverie, UI, and whatnot in itself, you have targeted the ability to hit also the web as well as native. Is that right?
Yep, but we thought about like the web as more of like a rapid prototyping experience, more so than a full-fledged platform that you'd chip on. So like you could build a Reverie app in the web, and then it would translate over to native code. But there's a lot of things missing to actually make a fully production-ready app in that environment. Things like accessibility. So we really view that more as like a rapid prototyping experience and something that you could ship on the web with.
Yeah, I mean, kind of along those lines, I'm curious about accessibility is like a really interesting topic, I think, right? Where it's partially built into the web. There are definitely, you know, attributes you can add to individual elements and whatnot. But it's kind of a first-class concern in many ways for maybe native apps. I mean, curious how you address accessibility in the progressive web app world, or if that's not even a concern on your side.
What I found is that at least the accessibility is better supported by default on native apps, meaning that when I ported my application from a desktop app to a browser app, I had people telling me, oh, it was working with a screen reader before, it's not the case anymore. That's clearly something that I missed while doing the changes. This being said, with the new approach of components using React or any other front-end framework or React Native, I think that we can there again do better than in native, because you can build the accessibility into your component, into your design system, and then you have for free and a consistent accessibility experience in the whole app. So we might not be there yet. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on it, but I think that we can do better.
I mean, part of it seems to come from maybe the chaotic nature of the web, right? Where Apple has its walled garden, and it may be walled, but it is a beautiful garden, right? Like they provide you with nice tools and whatnot. Whereas the web has kind of competing actors inside of it. And so you have to get everyone to agree on how accessibility is done and whether you're using React or Angular or whatnot. How do you kind of contend with the chaos whenever you're shipping these applications?
You don't?
Okay.
I definitely agree with your characterization that the web is chaotic when it comes to accessibility. I mean, we've done a lot of research around Gatsby, how Gatsby works with different screen readers, and it just works differently. Like some work exactly as we expect. You know, you change a route, and the screen reader announces that, and then I think Firefox doesn't, and like Safari, I forget exactly, but Safari does something goofy, where like Chrome and Windows works, I believe. Anyway, so I mean, this is something that we just made another hire for like OSS team that's working, spending a lot of her time on, kind of digging into this. And it might just end up that we have to, to make JavaScript, progressive web apps really actually work with screen readers, we have to, start making patches to the screen readers themselves or something like that to get things to work. Another sign of hope, I think, to kind of contain the chaos of this is that more and more kind of React component libraries are baking in good accessibility defaults from the start, and this is great because that gives you an even better baseline, so that you have these complex widgets, but someone's done a really thorough job of making sure that they're accessible to various types of disabilities. So I think that's sort of the future of things, is that more and more we use frameworks like Gatsby, which we do everything we can to make apps accessible, and then the component libraries we use as kind of the base for applications are also doing the right thing under the hood. And so as long as we don't inadvertently screw something up on top, then we're in a pretty good spot.
So React Native for Web has a really interesting accessibility pattern built into it, in the sense that if you make like a text element, right, if you're using that component, it will render by default like a span, like HTML element. But if you set the accessibility role to header, then all of a sudden now it renders an H1. And then if you set the like ARIA level to 2, now it's rendering an H2. So with React Native for Web, what it tried to do, what it does like pretty well, is it takes accessibility and it makes it less of this like add-on, and it makes it more of like a building block, like a foundational building block to accessing really core important parts of your like semantic HTML, which I think is really interesting, because if you want to go about adding these components, which you normally do, then you kind of do that via the accessibility, and then because it's React Native, that accessibility is now universal and applies to your iOS and Android screen readers. So I think, like what Kyle said, a lot of interesting accessibility patterns are kind of coming from the component library level.
To make it accessible once, and then it's accessible everywhere, kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right.
At least it starts
That is the dream.
Yeah.
So, I mean, accessibility is maybe one instance here. There are also other areas where I feel like native app development has some advantages over the web. So you have things like Interface Builder or Swift UI, where there's a very well-funded company that is able to hone these tools very nicely. Are there certain areas where you wish the web and progressive web apps were more capable, they had access to better tooling or better capabilities?
Mostly just the capabilities, like notifications and keeping the screen open and things like that would be nice, but a lot of that is very limiting by the manufacturer. Like, if you had access to all native functionality, there's a very low chance that you would go about building native apps for the majority of your applications. So I know that a lot of reasons why people would go with building a native app instead of a PWA is that inability to use notifications on iOS, which is very core to a lot of apps. So if that were available, I think a lot of people just they'd skip right over the native functionality part, which I would imagine Apple does not necessarily want at all.
I think that we would have less this debate if also PWA and web apps in general were into the app stores. Meaning that one thing that I don't like when I'm making a PWA, it's fine, but could I get this into the App Store or the Play Store, because it's something that people go to, it's just natural. And that would make the web apps more first-class citizen if they were next to native apps. I think that at some point it would be almost an implementation detail. Like, have you made a progressive web app or a native app? Oh, I don't care. As a user, I don't care because it's in the store. still it's not the case. But things are evolving with the trusted web activities by Google for the Play Store, but it's still an ongoing process.
What about things like access to kind of easy payments? So there, as much as a user I may not like in-app purchases, I think a lot of app developers like in-app purchases. And this is a thing that's maybe very difficult to build into a progressive web app. Are there like other capabilities that you don't even think of normally, where you're like, oh, if only we could do these? Like, where does the web have to catch up?
Bluetooth support. I don't know any apps that use Bluetooth, but people keep asking me for it daily. Payments is actually pretty straightforward, I think, in a lot of ways. Apple is like pretty open to accepting money. But there are a lot of smaller things. Like I know that Chrome has just like a list of various features that they constantly try to push through. Bluetooth is definitely one that I get requested a lot. There is a Bluetooth API, but it lacks a lot of functionality.
Is it like a web Bluetooth thing?
Yeah, I think people use it for like crypto apps, like crypto wallets.
I see.
Yeah.
It seems like the way to make a good technology bad is to prepend web to it, like WebGL or web Bluetooth, unfortunately. So, I mean, one of the concerns whenever you're targeting like native platforms, so like Android or iOS, is you kind of have to be intimately familiar with the hardware, right? And with progressive web apps, that's usually not the case. But like, have you found whenever you're trying to target, say, some Android devices, that it ends up being something you have to take into concern or consideration whenever you're actually shipping a progressive web app?
Yeah, I think it comes back to identifying what it is that you're trying to make. If you're trying to get your app into the hands of your users and you have a web app and you can just add certain baseline functionalities of that progressive web app offers, it's a very natural progression into that. And then you start to hit certain walls as you get into certain domains that I think native has really held their ground on. And if you already have a native app working or going for that, I don't think that there's necessarily that battleground where we're trying to push out native apps where they're already firmly situated. But yeah, I think as we get more refined APIs to access the hardware of the phones that we'll be working with, things will start to be a little bit more, there'll be an easy transition with that.
I just had sort of flashbacks to it, and I was working on a Cordova app, which is probably worse experience than a PWA right now. But dealing with like the Android versions was really rough. Like we had to ship on 4.4.5, and they had different versions of the web view baked in, and they all had different quirks and different bugs, and it was such a pain. I'm like having nightmares like reliving that. But native isn't a free lunch either, because of course Apple will change the API surface on you, and I've changed things with Catalina and stuff. So really, both ways have their problems.
I mean, did you have to be, let's say you were to take those Cordova apps that you're shipping to Android, if that had been a progressive web app, would that have removed a lot of those concerns?
I don't think so. I think it would still be stuck on that browser version. So usually it was like problems with like layout or rendering that were specific to that particular version, or quirks with the JavaScript engine. So I think we were kind of stuck with it. And maybe it's more like an Android problem. Like,
I guess along those lines, how have you seen kind of Gatsby fitting into the mobile app world? So a progressive web app in particular that's meant to be used on either tablets or Android devices. Are there any special considerations that you guys have built into it?
Not really. I mean, responsive, the responsive websites, whatever, media queries and whatnot, have been a thing for a while now. And so most people building for the web with Gatsby, just sort of, that's a pretty well understood art for doing that. The main thing that, Gatsby helps is that we just do everything we can to make your website /app as fast as it can. And so, which is like the main thing for making the website work on different versions of phones and tablets and so forth is the slower it is, the fewer you're just cutting off kind of the bottom end of the market. So whether people on bad networks or slow phones, then it becomes unusable. And so, we do a lot of things to make things fast, like the HTML loading, HTML first loading, code splitting by default and stuff like that.
So you can just basically effectively like embrace the platform, and things should work well.
Yeah, generally speaking, yeah. There is like the definite ability to make slow sites. Like how we like to say is like most frameworks, you kind of make your site fast, where the Gatsby, it's like it starts fast and you can make it slow. But if you just kind of like use the defaults and so forth, it's generally quite fast.
Well, I'm curious if there are any kind of closing thoughts from any of the panelists.
Yeah, I just thought of a list of features that don't work in PWAs. So you've got contacts like reading and writing. You've got calendars like reading and writing. The native photo gallery, you can't read or write to it. And then kind of just things of those nature where it's all these like nice to have features, which if you have like a social network, it imports your contacts and you can, all those features. I think what happens is people build their app and then they get to the part where they want to make it like a really nice comprehensive experience, and then those things don't exist, and that's just like a dead stop, and then they have to go and create a native app. And I think that's usually where people tend to end if they start very optimistically.
And do you see like one manufacturer, say, is Apple or Google more incentivized to add one of these than the other, or is it just both of them are incentivized to keep their native walled gardens?
Yeah, it seems like the Chrome team really wants to like add all these features. They do lots of talks about adding the features, and they really push the bar, I think. But.
Oh, very cool. Well, any other closing thoughts then? Do we have cause to be hopeful about PWAs, or are they like already like the golden standard?
I think that we can be hopeful for them, and that if there would be in an app store, nobody will see the difference again. So that would be a great improvement if we can get this at some point.
All right, well, I think that's about time. Thank you very much. Please thank all of the panelists for the discussion. Definitely appreciate it. Yep.